Welcome to our video introducing the long essay question, or LEQ, for the AP World History Modern exam. We'll start with a review of the exam format. There are stimulus multiple choice questions. There are 3 short answer questions. A DBQ, where the evidence comes from primarily documents, and the LEQ, where the evidence primarily comes from your brain. So in the LEQ, you're presented with a prompt that you just answer off the top of your head. It's basically a longer version of this standalone SAQ. You will have a choice of 3 prompts. Each of those prompts will require the same reasoning skill, such as cause and effect, comparison, or continuity and change over time. And they will cover 3 different time periods, and you'll get to pick the one you feel you can write the strongest essay on. For the rubric, you will be scored on contextualization and thesis, like all essays, your use of evidence to support your argument, the development of that evidence, which uses whatever historical reasoning skill the prompt is asking for to support your argument. And there is kind of a bonus point that we won't talk about much today, which is called complexity, in which you demonstrate complex understanding. And we usually introduce that after students have gotten pretty much expert at the other 5 points. So we'll look today at a sample prompt about trade networks from the time period 300 to 1450. Your first step, of course, as always, is to analyze the prompt. So I look at my prompt. It says, during the classical and post-classical eras, Afro-Eurasia had significant developments in trade connections and patterns. Develop an argument in which you analyze the extent to which trade networks between Africa and Eurasia changed from circa 300 CE to 1450 CE. Here's a reminder of what that prompt analysis process looks like. First, I need to identify the historical thinking skill. I see this word and I think immediately of CCOT, and I'm asked the extent to which they changed, and so I could have paragraphs based on continuities or changes. The next thing with the keywords, I know I'm talking about something that whether or not it changed, and the keywords is just what is that something? So what am I asked to think about? And the answer to that is trade networks between Africa and Eurasia. So these are those keywords right here. The third thing I need to do is decide what my categories of evidence are going to be, and these will be my body paragraphs. We're going to do a brainstorm exercise to figure that out. First, let's review those trade networks. When I see trade networks between Africa and Eurasia, I think of the Silk Roads, of the Indian Ocean, of the Trans-Saharan, and I'm reminded on this diagram of the circuits of world trade that there's connections happening. So this Mediterranean trade network, for instance, connects trade networks like the Silk Roads, which end here, the Indian Ocean, which come here, to Africa. Because the Silk Roads does not directly connect to Africa, but this Mediterranean sea trade provides a bridge so that that's possible. So those are trade networks I need to think about when I am brainstorming. And what I like to do is create a tool that matches the skill. For me, a flow chart works well for causation. Let's say I was doing something about the causes of World War I. And if I envision this little flow chart, and I would write down as many things as I can that cause World War I. For comparison, I like to do a T-chart. You know, I'm comparing thing A and thing B, and I write down everything I know about A and everything I know about B. And then maybe I'd look for, hey, look, this and this are the same, so that's going to be a similarity, and this are different, like that. And for continuity and change over time, because of the emphasis on over time, I like to make a timeline. So I like to split up my time period roughly into the beginning, middle, and end. I got these dates, 300 to 1450, from the prompt. And what I'll do is I'll think about my topic and I'll write down everything I know but that was going on roughly in the beginning of this time period, sometime in the middle, and sometime at the end, and then I'll be able to look for changes in continuity. So if I see the same thing repeated, then that would be a continuity, right? But if I see something different, then that would be a change. Once I figure that out, those are my categories of analysis, which will be my 2-part argument that I will use again for my body paragraphs. And those categories should always be based on that skill. So for this prompt, we'll talk about continuity and change, and that's why it was important for me to think about which of these 3 am I dealing with in this prompt. So I'm not going to read every single one of these. What I did is I brainstormed a lot of things and kind of see what I could come up with. So I wrote down things about who was kind of controlling it, like what country. Like I have India here, and then I have Islamic countries over here. I realized that diseases like plague were spread consistently over the whole time period. I put this in italics to remind myself that I knew the Mongols were a thing with trade networks, especially the Silk Roads. And I knew that was in the 1200s. And so I wrote it in the middle, and I started there, and then I thought, okay, if the Mongols controlled the Silk Roads in the 1200s, who controlled them before that? And that's where this one is coming from, about China being dominant on the Silk Roads. Notice I labeled my brainstorm by trade network because I was thinking of different trade networks. It wouldn't really work for me to say, in the beginning, Indian merchants controlled Indian Ocean trade, but a big change was the Mongols controlled Silk Roads trade, because those are actually two different things. So I need to stay with the same trade network. So notice I did silk, 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 and I have first China, then Mongols, and then China again. So that's kind of a little change that I could come up with. I wrote some stuff then about the Trans-Saharan trade network over here. I thought of Mali being dominant, but I couldn't really think of who was dominant back here. I wrote some stuff about technology like the compass, but I wasn't exactly sure what happened over here. So I wrote down a bunch of stuff that I won't use in my essay. Once I had all that information down, I wanted to step back and think about categories of analysis. So notice on Indian Ocean, I have who's in control in all three areas. First Indians, then Islamic, then Islamic. And I decided to make that kind of my first area of focus. And that, of course, is a change because it goes from Indian to Islamic. I also decided to make plague, the spread of disease, my second one. Notice I have that in 3 places. And that, because look, I've got plague spread, plague spread, plague spread with the Black Death. That is going to be a continuity. Now notice for this one, I'm stepping back a little bit, and it is okay for me to say disease was spread on trade networks, and for me to have Silk Roads happening here and Indian Ocean happening here. I just felt like with this change, with the who's in control of the trade network, it needed to be the same trade network to show the change. So that's okay as long as I define that in the way I write about the trade networks, for instance, in my thesis. Here's a reminder of that process we just went over. One point we're going to make when I try to make my categories is to avoid overly simple categories, like there were good and bad effects, or there were political causes, or something like that. It needs to be based on an answer to the question more specifically than those kinds of general terms. And here's an example of that. Based on what we talked about with the change from Indian to Islamic control and the disease, if I say in my thesis, they experienced a political change because this is what I'm thinking of here, and they had an environmental continuity because this is what I'm thinking of here, that's not specific enough. This is one that is more specific. So a change in political influence over trade from Asian to Islamic, and here's that beginning, middle, and end evidence I'm going to use. A continuity of the spread of disease, and here's that evidence I'm going to use. Remember, my thesis needs to have an argument. That would be the categories. That's why this is yellow and this is yellow. And then I need to add a reason. So I use those keywords from the prompt between 300 and 1450, trade networks between Africa and Eurasia. We talked about that. Experienced A. Continuity of the spread of disease because of cultural exchanges. So I asked myself, why did diseases spread? And I thought, well, it's because people from different cultures are interacting with each other, and that's how disease gets spread. Then I went on to my second idea, which is a change in who influenced trade from Asian to Islamic states. And I asked myself, why did Islam kind of take over and become so important? And I decided it was because of the religious focus of Islam about trade. Notice that these green things are very short. I will expand on those ideas later. So my thesis should not be super long, and it shouldn't make my entire argument. When we get to this reason here, what we are doing in the thesis is introducing the argument that will be explained later. Now that I know what my thesis is, I can think about body paragraphs. Unlike the DBQ, for the LEQ, the evidence is coming from the brain. It's really more like the outside evidence in the DBQ. Because of that, the method of writing the sentence is not as complicated. It doesn't have the same kind of lead-in requirements in terms of dealing with a document. I just need to be specific and accurate. If you look here, I just need to say a fact that's true. In my development, I need to connect the evidence to my argument, which is in the topic sentence. When I write my topic sentence, I just take half of my thesis, basically. And it's okay if you repeat half of your thesis, to be very clear. Make sure that reason makes it in there. Essentially, What's happening with my evidence and development is the same thing I do in an SAQ. It's just expanded. And we'll look at that here. Remember that an SAQ has that 3-sentence answer, a thesis, which has a 1-part argument and reason, evidence to support the argument, and then development to support the reason. In an LEQ, I'm basically in a body paragraph doing the same thing. My 1-part argument is half of the thesis. So remember, in an LEQ, I'll have probably 2 body paragraphs. I'm allowed to have 3. So I'm kind of doing this twice. I have specific evidence. I have my development. And then what I do is I do it again. The standard for an LEQ is more evidence. So if I had a body paragraph with just 1 piece of evidence, it would not be enough. So it's kind of like multiplying an SAQ times 2, and then you do that twice. That's why it's long instead of short. But the success criteria for this evidence development is basically the same thing. The only difference when I get to development is it needs to be a bit more expanded in an LEQ because the response is expected to be more in-depth. So now we'll look at what that evidence can look like. So here's that same note about what the evidence does. So for instance, during the 13th century, plague surfaced again, traveling all the way to Europe and causing the Black Death. Remember, I had a continuity of the spread of disease. This piece of information right here is specific, accurate, and proving my argument. This works as evidence. It's not as involved of a sentence as we have with those DBQ when we're citing evidence from documents. This should happen at least twice in my body paragraph. See, there's evidence with development, and then it happens again. Sometimes, particularly with CCOTs, I like to think of that beginning, middle, and end. So you can do it 3 times if you have more information to share. The more evidence, the better. One way you can have a lot of evidence is to repeat facts. So if I know that luxury goods were traded on the Silk Roads, and I say like porcelain and silk, that's actually 2 pieces of evidence. And I probably don't need to say they traded silk, and here's why. They traded porcelain, and here's why. It's going to be a bit repetitive. So I could repeat that, and then I just have my 1 development underneath that to explain this idea of luxury goods. So you can kind of clump things together, and sometimes there's a lot of clumping that happens. And if you have fewer times in your body paragraph when there is evidence, that's actually okay as long as you have evidence, 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 and then here's my development. You could do it that way. It just needs to be more than just an SAQ. For development, we are essentially explaining the evidence. That's kind of the simple, that kind of why question. But when we do that, we should be coming back at some point to the reason in the topic sentence. So when I think about plague and the Black Death, I think to myself, what does that have to do with trade networks? And why did that happen over this whole time period? What is it about trade and trade networks that causes disease to spread? And I thought, well, it brings diverse populations into contact with each other. That Silk Road's trade network spanned a big area, and so did the other ones. Some of those people are immune to disease, but they can introduce them to new populations. They can be carriers of things like plague. And in those populations, it spreads very quickly because there's no immunity. And if those people travel to trade, it spreads even more. So this is my thought process for development. I want to try to do it after each evidence, but what I've found is that the last place you have evidence in your body paragraph is the longest one that really makes that connection to the reason. So you can do like a little mini right after the evidence and then the long one at the end. And we'll see that with an example paragraph we have. You might want to pause and read this paragraph. I'm not going to read it over word for word. You can pause the video and read it. But basically, this is my sample body paragraph for that continuity of disease. So I took half of my thesis, so I have the same T3 and T4, argument and reason. Here's my evidence. Diseases like the plague in 300 were spread in the Arabian Peninsula on the east coast of Africa. In the 13th century, it surfaced again with the Black Death. By 1450, it was well established, having firmly established itself. I have a little mini development. Plague was native to Asia, and its presence in Africa shows the influence. It was spread by rats. Then, notice here I said the reason for this continuity. So we want the end development to focus on the skill of the essay and to give more information about what I have highlighted green here, which is trade brought diverse cultures into contact with each other. So this is a written out version of that thought process I went over on the previous slide. Diverse cultures into contact with each other, populations develop immunity. When new diseases are introduced, people with no immunity spread them. Indian Ocean trade grew, goods and merchants traveled distances. When they met to discuss trade, they spread disease, which took hold on populations with little immunity. By this method, diseases like the plague spread. So notice that this purple right here is the longest one. So I've just got a little mini guy here, and then I really get into it here. And all I'm done in green is basically introduced the argument that I make in detail down here. Here's what that would look like for the second body paragraph. This is that change about political control. I had proof of that first it was Indian merchants along Indian Ocean trade, and then I said, okay, Islamic control, and I tried to prove that with like Swahili city-states and the state of Malacca in Southeast Asia. And I'm going to follow that same format. With this sample, same idea. Here's the second half of my thesis, change in political influence from Asian to Islamic because of Islam's attitude towards merchants. I plugged in that Indian merchants, Swahili city-states, Malacca in my evidence. I had a brief explanation of that, why Indians were involved in the trade. Products like cotton and dyes were in high demand. Muslim traders had technology and they were able to get to East Africa. The importance of Malacca was a trade network, and then see the main reason for this development. So that's me coming back to this change right here. Islam's attitude towards trade, so I'm introducing this same idea I had over here. Muhammad was a merchant, and traditions of the religion held traders in high status. As a result, Islamic states facilitated trade rapidly, partly to gain tax revenues, but also to help traders maintain their status. So again, that last one is the longest one. And if I have a well thought out reason, I know when I get to the end of my paragraph, I just need to explain this reason in more detail. That's what the body paragraphs look like. The context rules are the same as we have with the DBQ. So I thought of some key elements happened before this time period, and this is before our class, which is why I picked this example, so it's okay if you don't know about this stuff. But the Roman Empire was extensively expanding the Mediterranean trade network. Before 300, the Silk Roads are beginning in China, and the Indian Ocean trade is also starting. So I can kind of set the scene and the context for what we're doing with this time period by establishing those trade networks. Common errors to avoid, details that aren't relevant to my argument. If I said Buddhism started in India and spread to China and people converted to Buddhism, that's a true statement, but it's not relevant to my argument because if you remember going over my two paragraphs, I didn't mention religion. I could have the spread of religion as a continuity for these trade networks, or I could have a change from this religion to that religion. So it could be relevant. I just need to be aware of what my argument is before I decide what my details are. I also need to avoid being vague. If my context says trade was important and growing, that's not specific enough. I really need some of that stuff in there. So there is kind of a specific requirement going on with the context. Here's what that looks like in a paragraph. This yellow part is the written out version of the details I just went over about the Roman Empire and China starting the Silk Roads. I added that transition sentence, the demand for goods contributed to the growth of trade between Africa and Eurasia with significant impact on societies. And then here is that same thesis when we went over before with the continuity of the spread of disease and a change in who influenced trade from Asian to Islamic states, and then of course those reasons. So that's about it. What an LEQ looks like is you have that intro paragraph with context and thesis. This is the same as the DBQ. In a body paragraph, you have your topic sentence, remember, which is half of your thesis. At least two places where you have evidence with development. That last development is the longer one that supports the argument you made here. You repeat it again, possibly a third time if you have three categories of analysis. It's up to you. In your conclusion, you restate your thesis in different words for a second chance to earn the thesis point when it is scored. That's your overview of how to write the LEQ, and we hope that that is helpful.